So now I will continue with the presentations and I'll try and do a very quick run through presentation, trying in an attempt to map the different pieces of legislation which have an impact on socioeconomic duties. It's not everything that should be in there. It's a best start at the moment. It's based on a report that the Equality and Human Rights Commission had done looking at existing duties that had a socioeconomic impact. And I wanted to try and part of the commitment from Scottish Government was for the person in my post to look at how all the legislation fits together, including human rights and public sector equality duty. So there's loads out there, and I've just started with that one. Oh, sorry, hold on a second. I forgot to tell you guys there was a clicker, sorry. Which Melissa kindly provided me. Didn't have it this morning. So okay, try again. What am I doing wrong? Oh, there we go, that's it, sorry. So basically, I've tried to capture some of the legislation. I'm not going to go through all of it in mega detail, but there are a number of pieces that have an impact on the delivery of the Fairer Scotland duty. There's such a plethora of pieces of legislation, it's not possible to capture all of them here. So I've narrowed it down to these ones for the ease of discussion and mapping. I'm not going to go into in-depth detail about each piece of legislation, we'd be here all night. And I also don't have an in-depth knowledge of every single piece of legislation either. I'm not a lawyer, and I've only touched on working in some of these, principally the Equality Act and the Community Empowerment Act. But I'm trying to just sort of give you a flavour, and then if we do have any questions or thoughts about how else we can link it, but also think of other bits of legislation we might want to include in this mapping that we think has an impact on the delivery of the Fairer Scotland duty. So quickly, the Universal Declaration on Human Rights, proclaimed in 1948, and the European Convention on Human Rights was followed that up and signed in 1950, came into effect in 1953. And each of the numbered articles within that protects a basic human right. Taken together, they allow people to lead free and dignified lives, and 47 states, including the UK, have signed up. There's also, backing that up, and which has become more and more to the fore recently, is the International Covenant on Economic, Social and Cultural Rights, which the UK ratified in 1976, but it's never been built into any of the legislation that we have. They're the main ones that link to the Fairer Scotland duty, and they include workplace rights, the rights to social security, the right to participation in cultural life, the rights to housing, food, water, healthcare and education. And they're set out in that international covenant, which hasn't been incorporated into Scotland or UK laws. And it's different to the others in that it's a reference to progressive realisation. You don't have to deliver the entire rights immediately, or you can move towards them. And the obligation to achieve a certain goal is an incremental one. Consequently, countries with greater economic resources, for example developed countries like ourselves, may have greater duties to realise economic, social and cultural rights than less well-off countries. And interestingly, they've been part of the debate in Scotland surrounding austerity, welfare rights and the appropriate response to the financial crisis. The First Minister's Advisory Group on Human Rights Leadership was set up by Scotland's First Minister to make recommendations on how Scotland can continue to lead by example in the field of human rights. And this includes economic, social, cultural and environmental rights. Operating independently from the Scottish Government, it published its report, Recommendations for a New Human Rights Framework to Improve People's Lives, in December last year. And the recommendations include the inclusion of economic, social and cultural and environmental rights into an Act of the Scottish Parliament. And a working group has been set up to progress the delivery of the recommendations. So it's interesting that Scotland's leading the way again in something like that, but also it will be interesting to think of the impact if that does become part of our legislation, how things like austerity and welfare reform are assessed within those rights. So moving on from the European Convention on Human Rights, there's the Human Rights Act, which came in 1998, and that sets out the fundamental rights and freedoms that everyone in the UK is entitled to, incorporating the European Convention into domestic law, and came in 2000. It's focused on human dignity rather than economic growth, and taking a human rights-based approach to tackling poverty and socio-economic inequality, it seeks to create an equal society in which everyone lives with dignity rather than being purely about wealth. Poverty is a human rights issue, and it represents a failure to fulfil the right to an adequate standard of living that is established in international human rights law. Other rights, like the right to education, to health and to adequate housing, are also affected by poverty. And human rights are impacted on things like welfare reform. So then, taking the Human Rights Act into Scotland, under the Scotland Act 98, there's a duty to both comply with the Human Rights Act through the European Convention on Human Rights. And in 2016, the Scottish Parliament gained its first lawmaking powers under the Scotland Act 2016, with many different powers, including the devolution of additional powers over equal opportunities, including to legislate for gender balance on public boards. So this allowed for the introduction of the Fairer Scotland duty. Many of you will be familiar with the Equality Act from 2010. The Act simplified, strengthened and harmonised previous legislation to provide Britain with a new discrimination law which protects individuals from unfair treatment and promotes a fair and more equal society. It also introduced the public sector equality duty, which requires public bodies to have due regard to eliminate discrimination, harassment and victimisation, to advance equality of opportunity between persons who share a relevant protected characteristics and those who don't, foster good relations between people who share a relevant protected characteristic and persons who don't share it. You'll be aware of the protected characteristics: age, disability, gender reassignment, marriage and civil partnership, race, religion or belief, sex, sexual orientation, pregnancy and maternity. And thinking about the Fairer Scotland duty and the public sector equality duty and the protected characteristics, children, disabled women, disabled people and women and older people are more likely to have been disproportionately affected by the changes to the welfare system, cuts in public sector spending and the rising cost of living, pushing them into poverty. So those most affected by austerity and welfare reform are women, disabled people and BME people, black and minority ethnic people. Today in Scotland, disabled people are twice as likely to be unemployed as non-disabled people. Ethnic minorities in Scotland are twice as likely to be living in poverty, twice as likely to be unemployed and 4 times as likely to be living in overcrowded housing. In the leading industry sectors, women are too often concentrated in junior or middle management posts or in low-paying roles. On average, women earn £182.90 per week less than men in Scotland. These are figures from the Equality and Human Rights Commission. So moving on, the Fairer Scotland duty we've already covered this morning. You know what it's about: paying due regard to socio-economic disadvantage and inequalities that they cause in line with our strategic decision making. So I'll not go into much more detail on that. You know, the different organisations it applies to, and I think it was referred to this morning, there's a particular provisions within the Equality Act. It means it's these ones, but new bodies can be brought in using regulations. So for example, Fire and Rescue, you would imagine they would come in, but also new bodies like the Social Security Scotland automatically go in because they are brought in via the sort of Scottish Minister's umbrella term. So I thought we'd cover the Children and Young People Act as well, because there's categories in here which have an impact on socio-economic disadvantage. It became law in 2014 and contains several changes to how children and young people in Scotland are cared for. Particularly, it introduces a duty on Scottish ministers to keep under consideration whether there are any steps which they could take which would or might secure better or further effect in Scotland of the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child requirements. And public bodies such as local authorities, health boards, Police Scotland and so on must now report every 3 years on what they've done to improve the rights of children and young people. As highlighted here in the yellow, there are a number of provisions in the Act which link to tackling socio-economic disadvantage and poverty. And these include supporting the rights of children and linking that back to the Equality and Human Rights and the Convention on the Rights of the Child. Agencies working together to create children's services planning should be looking at the best way to support children and young people and ensure the best start in life, which would include tackling socio-economic disadvantage. Increasing the amount of free childcare offered to 3-year-olds and some 2-year-olds and provision of daycare and out-of-school care should support people into work, and the provision of free school meals to all children of P1 to P3 helps to tackle poverty. There's changes afoot about that as well. And looked after children particularly tend to have poorer outcomes, so improving support for them through, for example, corporate parenting and the other services can make life fairer for them and minimise socio-economic disadvantage if we get it right. Moving on, we have the Community Empowerment Scotland Act. All the community planners will be sick to death of this Act. Came in 2015, but different parts of the Act have come into effect between 2015 and 2017 as the guidance has been published. The aim of the Act is to help empower community bodies through the ownership or control of land and buildings and by strengthening their voices in decisions about public services. There are 11 topics, including parts 1 and 2, about national outcomes and community planning, and they're the most relevant as they have particular reference to reducing inequalities. The majority of inequality is a result, basically, of poor socio-economic circumstances. So within your local outcome improvement plans and locality plans, there's a requirement to tackle inequality. Part 9 possibly be beneficial in terms of reducing socio-economic disadvantage if people are allowed to grow their own food. Involvement in parts 3, participation requests, and 10, participation in public decision making, which is, and I get this tongue-tied, participatory budgeting or community choices, could help people engage and potentially influence outcomes for people living in socio-economic disadvantage if they so choose to engage. Moving on, this is a very quick whistle-stop tour. I'm trying to make sure I do within the time I've got. The Education Act in 2016 introduced measures to improve Scottish education, including improving the attainment of pupils from poorer backgrounds. So very specific and direct potential impact in terms of looking at socio-economic disadvantage and a clear feed into the Fairer Scotland duty. So under school education, that covers that part about reducing inequalities for pupils as a result of socio-economic disadvantage or other causes. But also learning hours, free school meals and the clothing grants particularly can help with reducing the cost of the school day and so on. So again, if we're delivering that act, then we should be having an impact in terms of consideration of socio-economic disadvantage. And finally, the Child Poverty Act. We've got Hannah here today, who's the National Coordinator for that. And it's part of the Fairer Scotland Action Plan, which sets out the Scottish Government's overall strategy for tackling poverty and inequality in Scotland. The Child Poverty Act is targeted towards reducing child poverty and also contributes directly to the implementation of the Fairer Scotland duty, and the implementation of the Fairer Scotland duty should have a positive impact on the reduction of child poverty. So these are the sort of key elements of it, and it does link in quite clearly to what we're trying to do and the aims that we have for the delivery of the Fairer Scotland duty. So these are the sub-elements just lifted from the legislation that I've gone through, which should have the most impact and relevance to the implementation of the Fairer Scotland duty and vice versa. So consideration of the Fairer Scotland duty should help you to deliver on all these duties within this large range of legislation. And just as a final slide, I thought as I was going through, I was thinking there's different sort of subsets of people who the different bits of legislation are targeted towards. So obviously the Human Rights Act and the Scotland Act applies to everyone in Scotland, and the Education Act and the Children and Young People's Act obviously targets all children and young people with an emphasis on those with poorer outcomes. The other 4 pieces of legislation here target particular groups. Community Empowerment Act broadly focuses on those people experiencing inequality of outcomes in a range of its parts. Fairer Scotland duty obviously focuses on those on a low income compared to most others in Scotland, those with low wealth and in material deprivation, who may be living in deprived communities or are part of a community of interest. Public sector equality duty has its 9 protected characteristics, some of which correlate with the groupings within the child poverty guidance, particularly age, sex, given that lone parents are more likely to be female, disability and race. So I thought it was important to try and kind of capture some of that to see where the cross-cutting nature of them is, because there's so many bits of duties, and actually going round the tables with the first workshop, I was very aware that we're struggling to implement all these duties in a coherent way. So this is a kind of first attempt to try and pull some of that together and see where the cross-cutting parts are. So it's definitely not everything, and I definitely haven't managed to cover all the things that have an impact, but it's something I'd like to start a conversation with, either on the K-Hub or maybe with a future webinar or something like that, thinking about the legislation, the duty, how we bring it together, but also potentially sort of how we create some form of integrated impact assessment tool that lets us work with all these different duties in a way that makes it straightforward for local authorities and all the other partners and bodies subject to the duty to be able to sort of implement